For anyone with a passing interest of British history, the monarchy or the English Civil War, they will be aware of some of the most famous paintings of Charles I. Charles himself was an avid collector of art, and also employed some of the finest artists in history, men such as Rubens and Van Dyck. When we look at the famous paintings of the king, we can see classical images of regal authority, but we also see a coldness, a distance, certainly stubbornness, and perhaps an air of aloofness. However, King Charles I was also the subject of more hostile works of art through history, works of art that are not so commonly viewed. The first image is titled Cromwell and Charles I by Paul Delaroche. Delaroche was one of the most famous and highest paid painters in the 1830s. He is quoted to be of a generation who brooded on the French Revolution. In a lot of his work, he is said to have had an affinity with history's famous victims. He chose subjects which attacked the nervous system of the public. He was also known in his works to synchronize English and French history. He saw the English Civil War as a forerunner of the French Revolution, and he sees Napoleon as Cromwell and Louis XIV as Charles I. Despite a lack of evidence that Cromwell ever saw Charles in a coffin, he still painted this image and filled it with allegory. Did he see Cromwell as first and foremost a man of blood? After all, despite viewing a beheaded monarch, he still rests his hand on his sword. Cromwell himself stands on a checkered floor. Perhaps this is a suggestion of a chessboard. Had he outwitted, outplayed, and outmaneuvered the king like in a game of chess? The king with his head visibly stitched back on is not attired in majestic finery, but more like in a commoner's shroud. Again, the coffin is not being laid in regal state, but apparently just left on a chair. It seems clear that Delaroche was not a fan of Charles I, and even nearly 2 centuries later, he still painted him almost as a commoner. In response to this painting, Eugene Delacroix painted Cromwell with the coffin of Charles I. Delacroix is considered the leader of the French Romantic school of art. He is also one of the last old masters who was ever photographed. In this image, Cromwell is not front and centre, but at the side. It is almost as though he has just come across the body. The king has only his head visible, obviously a clear sign pointing to the king's execution, and like Delaroche, links Charles I to Louis XIV, who also lost his head. Delaroche then painted what is often called his masterpiece, Charles I insulted by soldiers. It is an image of the king a few days before his execution, where he is being bullied and taunted by parliamentary soldiers, even to the extent where one soldier is blowing smoke in the king's face. The king, surprisingly sympathetic for Delaroche, is shown to be calm, not rising to the taunts, and reading his book. We are fortunate that we still have this unusual painting. Whilst hanging in its home at Bridgewater House in London, it suffered terrible damage due to German bombing. On the 11th of May 1941, the deadliest night of the Blitz, the building was hit. The painting received extensive shrapnel damage. After the raid, the painting was rolled up and transported to a safe house in the Scottish borders, where it remained for nearly 70 years. When unrolled in 2009, for the first time since the war, 200 shrapnel tears were counted. A miracle indeed that it has survived.